Hugh Howey has probably done more than any other author to show the potential of self-publishing. He's the author of many books, including perhaps most famously Wool, which sold in the millions of copies and was self-published. Not surprisingly, the major publishers started courting him with seven-figure deals. And the unprecedented decision that you made was to turn those offers down. Could you tell us a little bit about why you did that and the hybrid agreement that you ended up reaching?
Sure. Yeah. The deals I was being offered, I would have killed for those deals just a little bit earlier in my career. It seemed like every time an offer came along, it was at the point that I was already making so much more than was being offered.
Right.
So I think the speed with which the series was taking off, and the fact that I could see my sales in real time, and I was getting paid monthly, all this operated at a much faster time scale than New York publishing is accustomed to, where it might be a year before you get your first royalty check, and you're paid every 6 months after that.
Right.
So yeah, I saw how lucrative the digital rights were, and I kept saying, if the book is already published, it's already a New York Times bestseller, I'm doing just fine with the digital. You're not going to get me into digital bookstores any more than I already am. So take the print rights, which I was doing okay with anyway, and let's see how big we can make this thing. And publishers weren't willing to do that. I think they know how lucrative the digital rights are as well. And so I kept saying no to offers, and we kept telling publishers what we were looking for. And it was Simon & Schuster who stepped up to the plate and offered a landmark deal, and very appreciative of them for doing that.
Which was print only, right? That's
Yeah, print only with wide distribution. They treated it like a front list title. They
right.
treated it like a very important title. I know it's sold over 100,000 copies just since they've had the book in bookstores. So they've done really well with it, and it just made sense for them to do what they do best, and for us to leave what was working alone.
And do you feel like the reason their offers weren't keeping up with your sales was because they were unaware of the sales, or because they're more risk averse than they should be?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. My feeling was that they were offering what they thought was competitive for what the book would do in the marketplace, but they have so many other costs involved. So what they're offering me, they have to take out what they want to make on the book. And I was, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kobo, these outlets, they pay authors 70% royalties, and publishers pay like 17%. So
If you're
you're
lucky.
look, yeah, you're looking at selling 5 times as many books to break even, and I wasn't convinced that any publisher could guarantee that.
Right, right. So Wool was originally conceived as a novella, and that's what you intended for it to be. Do you have any ideas? Are there any advantages to starting off that way? Would you do it again?
Yeah, and there's actually a model for it, especially in science fiction. Some of my favorite books started off as short stories or novelettes. Ender's Game, which is selling really well now because of the movie, that started off as a short story called The Battle Room, I believe, and Fahrenheit 451, which was another Simon & Schuster book, and one of the great science fiction and dystopian works of all time. That started off as a short story called The Fireman. Not many people are aware that these novels started off as short stories, because the novels get all the attention and all the sales, but the short story signifies demand from the readership. So it's common, especially in science fiction, to write a lot of short stories and publish them in magazines and anthologies, and you see which ones win an award, which ones take off, and then you write more of that. In my case, instead of waiting for an award or an editorial decision, the readers signified that they wanted more of something. And there's no, if everyone's trying to figure out what the readers want. well, who better to ask than the readers? So when they said, "Hey, we want more of this," I dropped what I was doing and wrote more of it.
And do you think that it's necessarily true that the better manuscripts will be discovered in the sea of self-published books?
I think they will. That doesn't mean that all of them will, and it doesn't mean that it'll happen quickly. But if a work is enticing, and that doesn't mean that it's beautifully written, though that can be what draws people in. I think it's a unique and engaging story and great characters. That's what readers are looking for, and that's why people they seem to not understand the success of books that they think aren't written well. But writing flowery prose or perfect sentence structure and all that is great in English classes and for your MFA. But to appeal to readers, you need a kick-ass story with kick-ass characters, and that's not something that you learn in a school. It's something that you learn from absorbing a lot of material. So I think if you write something that's powerful, um, and you get at least 100 people to look at it, if it's the kind of thing that when you read it, you tell 10 other people about it, those things are going to rise to the top. Now, that's going to mean that some works that are great plots that aren't written well enough are going to suffer, and some works that are written beautifully but don't have an engaging plot are going to sit in oblivion and be neglected. And I hate that. But the root cause of all of this is we don't have enough people reading. Most people on the street, that's not what they're doing with their free time, and that puts us, those of us who engage in writing, in a difficult situation.
Right, that's true. For the majority of authors who don't demand six-figure advances, what do you feel are the advantages to going with a publisher?
Well, there are some advantages to going with a publisher. I think the disadvantages are the reason more and more people are probably going to decide to turn down offers when they're already having success. One of the advantages is distribution. If you really want to see your book in a bookstore, you most likely have to go with a publisher. Now, Wool, as a self-published print-on-demand book, was showing up in bookstores because the demand got so great. So I don't think it's been adequately tested. I mean, I saw enough to know that this is possible. My book was showing up in Barnes and Noble, Powell's on the West Coast, a major bookstore, independent bookstore chain, was selling Wool as a print-on-demand book. It was in their staff pick section. It was given, you know, the kind of merchandising space that publishers pay for in other bookstores. So I know it's possible. I think what typically happens is when a book starts doing well, people say the only way for it to do better is to sign it all over to us. And no one has held out long enough to see a 50 Shades of Grey stay self-published, and bookstores can either, you know, be left out in the lurch, or they can order these books and stock them and make their customers happy and make a lot of money. Um, I experimented enough with that to see that it's possible that the books will show up, but it might take another success way beyond what happened with Wool to prove that there is no barrier for self-published books. Um, if you feel like you need editing and cover art, and you would rather give up, 5 times the royalty rate in order to pay for it rather than pay for it out of your pocket, you're paying for it one way or the other. It's not like you go to the big publisher, all this stuff comes for free. You're now paid 17% royalties. Your books are going to be priced, ebooks will be priced so much higher that they're not going to sell at the same rate. So you're going to pay for those services. It's just a question of how you want to pay for them. I think the other, you asked for the advantages of traditional publishing, but all these advantages come at the cost of the window of opportunity. Your book is going to get support for a very limited time window. It's going to be on bookshelves for 3 to 6 months. With your self-published books, maybe 10 years from now is when they take off. They stay fresh and unnoticed and completely new and ready to go for the rest of your life. And that's we haven't seen this game play out long enough to appreciate what that advantage entails.
So I think that's an important point. But with traditionally published books, they're also available as ebooks, right, forever.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, they are. if and if they do take off as an ebook, I think part of the problem is you don't see publishers promoting their weakest selling titles, and independent authors will take whatever's not selling well and they'll make it free. They'll make it $1. They'll make it $2. If it takes off again, then they can promote that. Publishers, when you're self-published, it behooves you to do whatever you can for your book to make it do well. You like to think when you sign with a publisher, they have the same motivation. Well, they do for a limited period of time, but then they have a conveyor belt of other books. And they're not going to go back and promote a book that's 6 years old, unless it's topical or that genre explodes, at the expense of the book they just signed for 6 figures and need it to do well now and hit the bestseller list. So that old book of yours is going to stay priced at $9.99 as an ebook, and you have no control over that. And I think it's hard to appreciate that advantage until you've worked both sides and until you see enough time go by to see how that'll play out.
I have to ask, you seem to know so much about publishing as if you've worked in publishing. How did you find out? Did you use certain resources? I know you were also a bookseller. Is that where a lot of your insights came from?
I mean, it started off as I'm passionate about it because I've been an avid reader my whole life, and I want to know where these things come from. It's like being a foodie, and you know about gardening techniques and where in the world different foods are grown and how they're grown. For me, it's I worked in bookstores when I was in college. I did it again while I was writing. I was a book critic. I wrote reviews professionally for a while. I went to book conferences. Working in a bookstore meant dealing with reps with publishers. But most of what I've learned has been in the last 2 years and on the fly. And if it sounds like I know what I'm talking about, it's don't buy into that, because none of us know what the heck's going on. It's all changing so quickly that I could tell you the state of where we are right now, but no one knows where things are going. But yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time now going to book conferences, and I've dealt with small presses, major publishers, foreign publishers. I've been on book tours. I've spent time at conferences talking to other authors. I've spent time online on forums. It's I view this as a profession, so I've spent the last 5 or 6 years of my life just learning as much as I can about it, and open-minded, just using logic and not saying, well, someone with 20 years of experience told me this and it must be true. You have to question everything because it's all changing so quickly.
Yeah, that's a great point. To authors, you know that a lot of authors still feel like they can only be a legitimate author if a publisher publishes them. What do you say to them?
Yeah, I understand that impulse, and I can agree with it. My heart goes out to the people who you languish in obscurity for so long, and just to have an editor say we love your work and put their stamp of approval on it, and have Random House or Simon & Schuster on the spine of your book. I've gone through that. I've got books with both of those publishers, and it's wonderful to work with them, and I value my relationship with the editorial team and the marketing team, the publicity team. I've worked with all these people, and they all love books, and I love them like family. So the desire to be a part of that is intense, and I understand that. I think that what I would say is to diversify, just to see the difference, and what works for you might be different than what works for me. I just know that there's never been this many people making a living with their writing before in history. So we're seeing a mid-list of self-published authors exploding and writing full-time and paying all their bills with their writing. And I don't know that there's any, I certainly haven't felt anything from my publishers as strong as what I feel from my readership. And when I sell hundreds of thousands of copies and I'm, paying my bills and staying at home and writing all day, that makes me feel more like an author than having a $5,000 advance, 3 months window in a bookstore, and then a book that goes out of print. That's the cynicism that I bring to it is I work in a bookstore. I worked with authors every day, professors and visiting authors who came to talk to our students, and they all had day jobs, and my dream has been to write for a living, and self-publishing makes that more possible for more people than the traditional system. Maybe that could change in the future, but that's just the reality right now.
Yeah. You mentioned the editorial team and the marketing team that you now feel very close to, and I know that Jack Fogg is an editor of yours. What do you feel he did for your manuscript? What was that experience?
Jack, I, I consider, even though I've got this print-only deal with Simon & Schuster in the U.S., they largely published a book that was already finished and had made very small changes, mostly to Americanize from the UK edition. Um, but I consider Jack my editor, and I consider Random House in the UK my publisher, because they were the first English language deal that I did. And I love Jack like a brother, and he made the work so much stronger. And his challenge was to take 5 books that were published serialized, like a Dickens novel, and turn it into a single novel. And um, one of the decisions that he made was to take characters that appear in later books and introduce them earlier to tie it in together. And he left how to do that up to me, and he supported my method of doing that. But that's an editor's job. More, the copy editing was important too. The manuscript was very clean at this point, but seeing the whole work and how it's going to play out. But where Jack was brilliant was managing a team, to how the proofs went out, how the advertising and marketing were done, the cover art. He really has to manage a whole lot of people and ideas. And the launch, I mean, it's still the #1 hardback debut in the last year. So they've done an amazing job in the UK, and I credit a lot of that to Jack Vaughn.
Oh, that's wonderful. You never, sorry, I don't do many interviews. um,
You're doing great.
you never expected to see this level of success, am I right?
Yeah, I mean, who does?
Yeah.
I never went into this thinking I would sell 1 million books. It's insane.
And you spent, I think, 4 years writing before your first success. So why did you write during that time? What kept you going?
Oh, I enjoyed it. I've always wanted to write, but I never thought that I had the dedication to see a novel to its conclusion. But ever since when I was young, as an avid reader, I always dreamed of being an author and writing a book. So when I wrote that first one, and this is after years of trying and giving up, and I finally completed a book, and it was largely just because my wife was enjoying what she was reading as I was writing it. She wanted to see how it ended, and I loved the story, and I wanted to see how it ended. So once I finished that and sent it out and gave it to friends and family to read, the feedback I got was just tremendous. And I think having that feedback mechanism where people are saying, well, we want the next book, and you enjoyed the process, a sense of completion to finish a book. So I started the next one, and I fell in love with the thrill of creating new stories and then wrapping them up in a fun way, and putting them in people's hands and seeing their reaction, and it's just built on itself. But yeah, it's hard to impress on people what it's like to go for 3 or 4 years of getting up every morning and spending hours writing, when you could spend that time on Facebook or watching TV or playing video games, or there's so many other fun things you could do with your time. You can maybe sustain that for a month or a week or a few months, but to do it for years requires a love of what you're doing. I see people with other hobbies all the time, and I'm like, how can you? Like, my sister is this fantastic knitter. She had a yarn shop, and she can create anything with yarn. I'm like, but how can you do that for that many hours every single day? Well, it's because she loves it, so it's easy for her to do it. And it has to be that way with your writing, I think.
And how much time do you contribute to each manuscript before you feel like it's a final draft, on average?
It's a rough process for me. I write a rough draft, and I probably do 7 to 9 full revisions before I'm done with it. And each one goes quicker and quicker because there's less to change. But that first rewrite is painful. The second one is minor, And then from there, I'm just going through and looking for anything that has weakness and any sentence that I trip over, and by the end, I'm just rearranging commas. But I can write a novel in 3 months, and probably 2 months of that is spent writing, and a month is spent revising and editing.
That's impressive. Did you get to that stage where it only took 3 months, or was that always the case?
It's actually this is really sad to say, but it's actually grown into a longer process. My my first novel I wrote in 2 weeks, and those
Wow.
were 10-hour days. Yeah, and that book has done really well. It's one of my favorite books. I NaNoWriMo, this National Novel Writing Month, where you write 50,000 word novel in 1 month. It taught me that my best writing occurs when I write more per day. The idea of writing like 500 words a day for an entire year to write a novel, I think you just have a disjointed. You never get to your good words. If you only write 500 words in a day, you never get to your good stuff because you're just limbering up in that period. That's all the stuff you're going to delete or revise to oblivion later. It's when I'm having a big day and I'm like writing 4 or 5,000 words. It's the fourth and fifth and 6,000 words that are the best. That's when you're reading. You're just tearing through a book when you're really in a zone. And those parts of the book that are that good are usually written. For me, they're written when you just can't keep up with the action. It's just coming so smoothly and so effortlessly. So, other things are getting in the way of writing as compressed as I would like to write. So that 3 months is much looser than it used to be for me.
Oh, yeah, I haven't heard that before. That's interesting. Um,
I think authors like to tell people that what they do is a lot harder than it really is. But I mean, a lot of the writers I know who write a book a year, they do it in 3 or 4 months, and they spend the rest of the year agonizing about not writing or promoting or doing work in their day job. But it's more common than you might think. With the writing groups I've been a part of, for people to write novels in just a few months.
do you feel like it's also important to leave the draft at some point, spend time away from it, and then come back and having reached a certain level of that objectivity?
I think that can be useful, especially before submitting the work to people. I think what can be dangerous is writing a rough draft and then stepping away from it
Right.
and coming back for the revision. You need to have the entire book in your mind where almost every paragraph is memorized, so you know how to foreshadow and what your themes are, and everything that every character has said and done and how they interact with each other to make it completely realistic. And the only way to do that is to get to where you're revising the book. My last revisions I can do in a single day. I'll go through the entire book in 8 hours, just like a reader would, if they're reading the whole book in one day. And I'll read it all in that one session. And that's the only reading where I get a full sense of how the book comes together.
Right.
So I think abandoning the book to get objectivity, you're more likely to abandon the book and forget what you've written. And then you come back and have to relearn it all. And maybe there's something to that, but I don't think it would work well for me.
Okay. When it comes to your next book, what do you plan to do? Self-publish or another hybrid um,
I, yeah,
publication?
I've written several books since Wolf took off. iZombie, which continues to do very
Oh, I
well.
didn't realize that was a more
And
recent. Okay.
yeah, that was in the middle of the Shift books, and so the three Shift books and Dust, and I self-published all of those. My relationship is directly with the reader. Publishers can come to me afterward and say, "Hey, we really love this, and you're selling a lot of copies, and we'd love to sell some copies with you." And be part of that discussion. But I think I would write an inferior product and I would delay that product to market if I thought of the publisher as my customer or the agent as my customer. So what genres do you like? And I'll write that. Or what story are you looking for? Are you looking for a carbon copy of the last thing that I wrote? Okay, then I'll write that. And I would much rather think of myself as a reader and look at my readership and say, what do we want next? And what's going to make me happy and push the envelope, and so self-publishing allows that and gets the product to the reader quicker and at a lower price. And if a publisher or a bookstore wants to get involved, hey, it's completely open. I'll have any conversation, but meanwhile, the readers are going to be reading and reviewing the book and talking about it and sharing it with other people.
What do you see as the future of publishing 5 years from now? What's the
Um,
landscape going to be like?
I think on the bookstore side, I think the major chains might be in even worse shape than they are now. I think Barnes and Noble might not be here in its current iteration in 5 years. If it's still here, it's going to be under the Barnes and Noble name, but the bookstore size will be much smaller. I think their footprints are too big to be sustainable. I think independent bookstores are going to continue to thrive. They're kind of a cherished institution in towns, and I think people will support them when the chains are hurting, and that's already happening. Independent bookstores are seeing growth. Um, I think people will continue to read, more and more of that will be done digitally, but we'll always have print books. I think it'll continue to be a great time to be a writer because of the cost of distribution being practically zero and the cost of production being practically zero. I think good days are ahead. My worry with the publishing industry isn't the turmoil within it, but the barbarians beyond the gates, so to say. I think there are just so many ways you can spend your time, and I think reading is a very old and very storied tradition, pardon the pun, that I don't think it'll go away completely, but I do worry that people are going to do more of their reading online in non-book form, and that will hurt an industry that I love. Of course, I sound like someone who loves opera and bemoans the fact that not every major city has an opera house and no one goes to the opera, and why doesn't everyone listen to opera, and what's wrong with these kids these days? And I don't ever want to I don't ever want to push something that I love on the rest of the populace. If it goes away, I'll be sad, but I won't say, you people who are happy doing something else should be happy doing what I love. I think that's crazy. So that's my only fear, but I think we'll get through it. I think reading will continue to grow because God, devices and prices, there's a lot to be said for the changes in the industry right now from the reader's perspective.
And I think you made a very good point when you said that the story is the most important factor. Do you feel like some people are just innate storytellers? You either have it or you don't, or it's something that you can develop within yourself?
I think anyone can develop it. I think it's something that that you think should come easy. So when you try it and you're like, well, I don't know what happens, and so like it's a bar scene and I don't know what the characters say to each other. Well, if you put me on a basketball court with a basketball for the first time and you said, now throw this through that little ring 30 feet away, I would say that's not possible. And then you would show me someone swishing 20 of those in a row, and I would think the guy was using magic or something. So you have to practice, and you don't know what you're capable of until you do it. So I think anyone can tell a good story. It requires absorbing a lot of stories, and observing the human condition, reading a lot of history and philosophy and psychology and the things that teach us about the way humans think and interact and the way we are. And but yeah, if you take in enough stories and you start writing a few of your own, you'll realize like, oh, I just came up with a plot twist, and I had no idea I knew how to do that, and now I just saw myself do it, and even though it felt magical, that means I'm capable of it.
Right. And I read that you primarily read nonfiction, which you just mentioned in books. Are there any nonfiction books that you feel were influential in teaching you about these universal truths, how people think?
Yeah, if I had to name, just one or two that I think everyone should read, Steven Pinker wrote a book called The Blank Slate that I think is one of the most important books any author could ever read, an author of fiction, because there's more truth about human nature and why we are the way we are in that book than in any other single book I've ever read. Um, Another book that I think is very important is called What Technology Wants by Kevin Kelly. And that was only came out in the last few years. But that gives you a sense of how the things that occur in society aren't often as directed by individuals as we think they are. When we think of the automotive industry, we think of Ford, and that one man created all this. And when we think of aviation, we think of the Wright brothers. And this book will show you that a lot of things that happen just find their time. And there's so many cultural influences that make more sense after you've read this book. And those are the things that inform my stories more than just having read other stories.
Oh, great. I love it. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I really
My pleasure.
appreciate it.
You should do more interviews. You're great at this.
Oh, please. That's not true, but thanks.